The cave was not marked on any map, though plenty of people knew where it was. In the mountains, those were often the same thing. The locals called it the Hollow, a name that meant little by itself. There were dozens of hollows scattered through the Appalachian ridges of eastern Kentucky, each tucked between steep wooded slopes and crossed by creeks that flashed silver through the trees. Most were ordinary places. A few had stories attached to them. This one had warnings. Ethan Mercer first heard about the hollow from his grandfather on a rainy afternoon in October. He was 12 years old at the time, sitting on the porch of the old family house while mist drifted through the valley below. The mountains rose on every side, dark and folded against the horizon like sleeping giants. His grandfather was a man who rarely spoke about superstition. He had spent 40 years working timber and another 20 farming a stubborn patch of rocky land. He trusted fences, weather reports, and the condition of a man's handshake. Ghost stories were for children, which was why Ethan never forgot what he said. "You ever find yourself on Blackthorn Ridge?" the old man remarked without looking up from his coffee. "And somebody offers to show you the hollow, you tell him no." Ethan grinned. "What's in it?" His grandfather remained silent for so long that Ethan thought he hadn't heard. Finally he said, "Nothing good." That answer only made him more curious. "What is it?" "A cave." The old man stared out at the mountains. Rain tapped softly against the porch roof. "It's a place that ought not be there." That was all he would say. No amount of questioning could draw another word from him. Years passed. Ethan left for college, found work as a surveyor, and eventually returned to the county after his grandfather's death. By then, the story had become little more than a childhood memory. Until the summer the cave appeared again. A week of relentless storms had battered the mountains. Creeks overflowed their banks. Roads washed out. Entire hillsides collapsed beneath the weight of soaked earth. 3 days after the rain finally stopped, Ethan received an assignment from the Forestry Service to inspect a section of Blackthorn Ridge for damage. The name struck him immediately. He had not thought about his grandfather's warning in years. Still, a ridge was a ridge. There was nothing unusual about it. He packed his equipment and headed out shortly after sunrise. The morning was cool and damp. Mist lingered among the trees, turning the forest silver and gray. Water dripped from hemlock branches overhead, and the scent of wet earth hung heavy in the air. For several hours the work was uneventful. He documented erosion, marked unstable ground, and photographed areas where fallen trees blocked old trails. By noon he had nearly completed the survey. That was when he noticed the opening in the hillside. At first glance it looked like the aftermath of a landslide. A section of earth had collapsed away, exposing bare stone beneath. Yet the longer he studied it, the stranger it appeared. The opening was too regular, too smooth. It resembled a doorway carved into the mountain. Ethan checked his maps. Nothing. No cave, no mine, no geological feature of any kind. He found himself staring at the darkness beyond the entrance. A cool draft emerged from within. Not merely cool, cold. The kind of cold that belonged to deep winter, not a humid Appalachian summer. For reasons he could not explain, he thought of his grandfather. You tell him no. The memory almost made him laugh. He was a grown man standing alone in the woods. The mountains were filled with caves. This one had likely been uncovered by the storms. Yet as he approached, a peculiar unease settled over him. The forest had grown quiet, not silent, just subdued. The constant chorus of insects seemed distant now, as though he were listening to them through several closed doors. He switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. The passage descended at a gradual angle. The walls were smooth limestone veined with darker minerals that glittered beneath the beam. Water should have been dripping from the ceiling after the recent storms, but Ethan heard none. The cave felt dry. Still, the air carried a faint odor he could not identify. It reminded him of old books left untouched for decades. He walked for perhaps 15 minutes before noticing another strange detail. The tunnel showed signs of use. Not recent use, old use. The floor had been worn smooth in places, as though generations of feet had passed through. Ethan knelt and examined the ground. There were no modern boot prints, no tire tracks, no discarded equipment, nothing that suggested contemporary visitors. Yet the passage did not feel untouched. It felt inhabited. The realization unsettled him. A cave should not feel inhabited. The tunnel eventually widened into a vast chamber. Ethan stopped at the threshold. His flashlight could not illuminate the ceiling. Massive columns of stone rose into darkness overhead, disappearing from view. The cavern stretched so far in every direction that it felt less like a cave and more like an underground world. For a long moment he simply stood there. The scale of the place was breathtaking. Then his light found the footprints. Hundreds of them covered the dusty floor. Bare footprints, some large, some small. A few looked ancient enough to have been preserved for decades. Others appeared almost fresh. They moved through the cavern in loose, wandering paths, converging toward the far side where darkness swallowed everything beyond the reach of his flashlight. Ethan's first thought was that he had discovered evidence of an undocumented historical site. Perhaps an indigenous ceremonial cave. Perhaps something even older. Momentarily displaced his unease. He began photographing the tracks. The flash illuminated the chamber in brief bursts of white light. With each photograph, the darkness seemed to leap back into place a little faster. When he reviewed the images on his camera, he noticed something odd. A figure appeared in the background of one photograph. Tall, pale, standing between two distant columns. Ethan frowned. He zoomed in. The image became grainy and indistinct. The figure could easily have been a trick of light and shadow. Still, he found himself turning to look behind him. Nothing stood there. The cavern remained empty. He laughed quietly at his own nerves and continued deeper. Several minutes later, he reached the center of the chamber. There he found a circular pit. The opening measured perhaps 20 feet across and dropped straight downward into darkness. The footprints ended around its edge. Every single one of them. Ethan crouched and shined his flashlight down. The beam disappeared long before reaching a bottom. A chill spread through him. The pit looked unnatural. Not man-made, not carved, simply wrong. As though the earth itself had opened and never finished closing. Then he heard a voice. Ethan. The sound was faint, barely more than a whisper. He straightened immediately. Hello! His voice echoed through the chamber. No answer came, only silence. He waited. Several seconds passed. Then the voice returned. Ethan. This time he recognized it. His grandfather. Every hair on his body stood on end. The voice had come from the pit. That was impossible. His grandfather had been dead for nearly 7 years. Ethan took an involuntary step backward. The darkness below seemed deeper than before. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Not the warning itself. The expression on his grandfather's face when he gave it. Fear. Real fear. The kind Ethan had never seen in him before or since. Something moved at the edge of his flashlight beam. He turned. A pale shape stood between the stone columns. Tall, motionless, watching. For several seconds he convinced himself it was a rock formation. Then it shifted. Only slightly. Enough. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Another pale figure stood farther back. Then another. And another. The cavern was no longer empty. The shapes emerged gradually from the darkness, as though they had always been there and only now allowed themselves to be seen. They resembled people. Almost. Their limbs were too long, their posture too rigid. Most disturbing of all were their faces, or rather the absence of faces. Smooth white skin stretched across featureless heads. No eyes, no mouths, no noses. Yet Ethan felt their attention fixed upon him. The voice rose again from the pit. Come closer. It still sounded like his grandfather. Only now there was something wrong beneath it. A second voice. The third. Many voices layered together. The pale figures began moving. Not quickly, not threateningly. They simply took a step forward. Then another. The sound of bare feet echoed softly through the chamber. Ethan backed away. The figures continued advancing. He glanced toward the tunnel. It suddenly seemed impossibly far away. The cavern felt larger than before. the darkness between the columns deeper, as though the mountain were rearranging itself around him. The voices multiplied. His grandfather, his mother, old friends, teachers from childhood. Each voice called his name with gentle familiarity. Each invited him to come closer to the pit, to look inside, to see what waited below. Ethan turned and ran. The chamber exploded with movement behind him. Hundreds of footsteps struck stone. He sprinted through the tunnel, his flashlight bouncing wildly across the walls. The cold air rushed past him. The voices followed, never shouting, never threatening. They spoke with patient certainty, like people calling after someone who had forgotten an important appointment. The tunnel seemed endless. Twice he nearly fell. Once he glanced over his shoulder. He regretted it instantly. The pale figures filled the passage from wall to wall. Not running, walking. Their featureless faces remained fixed upon him. Yet somehow they were gaining ground. Ethan pushed himself harder. Daylight finally appeared ahead. He burst from the cave and stumbled into the forest. The moment he crossed the threshold, the voices ceased. The silence that followed was startling. Birds sang. Wind rustled through the trees. A squirrel darted across a fallen log nearby. The ordinary world had returned. For several minutes, Ethan sat on the ground, struggling to catch his breath. Eventually, he looked back toward the hillside. The entrance was gone. In its place stood an unbroken wall of stone covered with moss. There was no opening, no landslide, no evidence a cave had ever existed. Only the mountain. Watching, waiting. Ethan never returned to Blackthorn Ridge. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind moves through the trees outside, he remembers one final detail. As he fled the cavern, just before reaching daylight, he heard his grandfather's voice one last time. Unlike the others, it had not been calling him deeper. It had been shouting, a warning, the only warning he ever received. Don't let them learn your face.